Shirley here with Sirius Talisman. This is Abundant Hour of Jupiter Saturn Day, and the moon is separating from a square to Chiron. So I want to talk about how can we address the big transits, like the outer planets and Chiron, before they actually mature. And I want to talk about um, energy crystals in Saturn, Pluto and essential oils, Neptune, Saturn, and be wearing pyramid schemes in sourcing our material. Now, or healing pyramid schemes like Scientology, um, which goes beyond, which goes beyond the monetary fraud. Um, a lot on the menu. Mars is separating from Rahu. Let's begin to and Mercury is applying to approach Mars and Rahu. Um, Again, we have this triple conjunction in Pisces of Mars, Rahu, and Mercury, and I'd consider Rahu a part of the conjunction. Big topic. Let's begin with Chiron. The sign where Chiron is at, deriving from basically Tom Jacobs, rest in peace, they talked about Chiron as embodiment. And I believe he had Chiron in Taurus. But the sign that Chiron is at is telling us the motivation and the clues as to how to address the Chiron wound. For example, right now we have transiting Chiron in Aries. Um, oh, okay. There would always be more to elaborate on that. So I'll begin with the points. Right now we have Chiron in Aries, and so the wound around the sense of self, the sovereignty, even financial independence, um, and self determination, if we see it on a mundane level, is the chironic wound that is being addressed. And we also see that, um, as anything Aries, it calls for the self to be one's own best doctor. While Chiron always have the attributes of the wounded healer or the person that is sifting and sorting the medicine for itself, um, this is also where we would have um, Chiron really emphasized through Aries with that archetype. And we can continue on down the list, um, and actually have a bigger episode about that. However, the sign is giving us the clues, by the planet that rules the sign, and the notion that with Chiron there is always a reinventing the wheel when it comes to the contemporary type of healings. Okay, so this is a little bit of a snippet about Chiron. Um, when it comes to, it looks like I will need to readjust my recording equipment soon. Um, so while Chiron matures at 50, we still have the understanding that, even if you have the basis understanding that, in regards to a Chiron wound, we are, even outside of Aries, sifting and sorting the medicine for ourselves. And it means that the contemporary medicine is not good enough. I think about when Chiron was in Pisces, this was also when I would run into astrology. And because astrology would speak about whether being energy sensitive or sensitive emotionally or all things Pisces, that there would be no healing models available outside of, let's say, looking at my own chart at astro.com. However, um, however, not even close to having a professional reading by astrologer, this was actually even the point. I'm not saying astrologers cannot consultate on Chiron, but definitely, in fact, they can best consultate on Chiron because this is where we actually take into account that the person in front of us is reinventing the wheel, and we have a limited ability to beyond to even show them where the clear water is, because as the water is being polluted, they will need to navigate with their own sense of self or embodiment if it's Taurus, or curating or trying and playing around with different methods if it's Gemini, and so on and so forth, to get to what is the fresh water for them. Um, well, I just thinking about people with Chiron in Cancer would be around 1988, 89, and onward, and how the wound around the water and the connection to ritual abuse, actually the Epstein Barr, was making itself also the current Pisces that have the oceanic, which was to do with more the faith and the consciousness. Um, and Cancer is also the water, so those are all water signs, and the clarity of the water. Um, there are many more things with the sense of belonging, the Scientology versus healing that is not a bait or by control. I'm going to talk about Moon and Pluto as well. Now let's talk about the outer planets, but before that, the closest to outer planets is Saturn. And Saturn rules rocks in energy crystals. So the time where I began to work with energy crystals was going from my Saturn return to Saturn maturation, and I was accidentally going through a crystal shop. I was really addicted to coffee because I had no money to buy food, and and I was finding these crystal pebbles that I just bought as something to concentrate on, other than my next meal or coffee or basically my hunger. Um, that would lead into noticing patterns and really learning to the detail a lot about each energy of each crystal. Um, so Saturn transits can be good use when it comes to crystal energy, and then we can join the relevant energy of the planets that it crosses through. Um, Again, I'm not talking about the Vedic remediation using crystals. That is completely a, an elaborated trajectory that requires a deeper look into astrology. Um, but Saturn is really a lot about learning about the rocks, learning about the minerals. Um, for example, with Neptune in my second house, and I was learning about the radiation around cobalto. It's not cobalto cyanide. It's I don't remember what is, but this is basically how the risks of mining, um, even mining for energy crystals that we're not so aware of, and Neptune is also hospitals. And Feynman AI was talking about the radiation within the hospitals, or when we buy an old hospital and rejuvenate that, which is an excellent thing to do for people in general with Neptune sextile Pluto. But we need to be aware of the radiation risks of having an old, let's say, Röntgen, um, It's not just the Röntgen; it's something that they use for even the what they use to curate cancer, that in other frequencies can create cancer, and we run the risk of not even knowing um, by the time it had already affected the DNA. So Saturn, Neptune radiation, Saturn, and also Neptune Saturn, something is missing, and Saturn rocks and minerals, but Neptune is also hospitals, and Saturn means old, and so Eris is my second house, so buying old hospitals and renovating them, we must be aware of the radiation risks involved and accurately adapt. Um, more things. Uh, uh, now let's talk about Pluto. Pluto rules the essence of something, and it also rules nuclear energy, oil. But the big importance I found of essential oils during Pluto transits. And all of those methods, whether it's energy crystals or essential oils when are not sourced from like a pyramid scheme, those are ways to begin to not hack the system, but actually tend to the outer planet before we had, let's say, the Pluto square or the Saturn return. And the reason being is that if we begin to prepare for the energy, then actually going through the transits is way less scary, and we're way more adept than if we don't. So with the outer planets, we always want to think about the fact that they are intergenerational. So whatever we are dealing with that is, let's say, plutonic, or if I think about the Epstein Barr, Saturn, Neptune in Aries was the linking of the Epstein files. And so many people in the years coming to the Epstein files were dealing with the accumulation of, whether it's the silencing, the whistleblowers, the chronic ailments that seemed, whether miraculous healing or finding the root cause of an ailment, and finding out that the reason that we couldn't heal, whether even what was considered psychiatric, because Neptune is psychiatry, Aries represents patient sovereignty, and I can talk about Neptune and the way psychiatry is kind of each and every one of those could be a completely an entire episode where I could talk about Neptune and psychiatry throughout the signs and the aspects to other planets and the development of psychiatry from a myth to um, basically understanding the connection with psychiatry and mafia and intelligence in the age of Gladio, and how it both contributed to mental health awareness, because that would be good for the informants, but also deprived people of having accurate psychiatric healing, as that would expose the many things that are happening, what people call whether deep state or global intelligences, um, and just think about the fact that in the sign of Aries, it interferes with our sense of self and sovereignty and the real estate that we use for our survival needs, and so it is housing by the merit of the survival needs real estate and the absorption of the minerals. So people have no choice but to tend to that and to demand patient sovereignty. Um, by and large, as a holistic health practitioner, I saw a lot of situations where people were separated from their families. The families believed the doctors sometimes believed themselves, and the patient was basically going through an isolation where they would not be able to recover, they would not be able to speak, um, and the side effects of the treatment that they would be getting would be so terrible that they would have to cut contact with the family and friends and go missing. Sometimes people were unaliving themselves. Sometimes that would expose them to many things from trafficking, cults, and so on. Um, and this is all linked to things like the Epstein Barr that were permeating the academic institutions, but also the hospitals themselves. If we go to who owns so and so mental health facilities or hospitals, I'm sure we will find linkage. And I actually saw MK Ultra Monarch programming around various mental health facilities around 7th of October, the fiasco of hospitalizing the Nova survivors in Itanim, which was litigated, it was class litigated for torturing patients that were rape victims. Like I said, Epstein Barr, okay? The torturing of people in hospitals, and then these people going missing um, or being used um, against their wish, which denotes the fact that, particularly in the age of Saturn and Neptune, most of what we hear as a spy is actually a person that was kidnapped, tortured, raped, and drugged, um, and then not basically was put under mind control. And even in the cases where people do apply to intelligence, they would be checked by all the psychologists and psychiatrists, but would be going through training that was meant to deconstruct them psychologically and psychiatrically, without ability to offer them actual recovery. Um, and and that's the thing. Should I talk about the Chiron myself now? Certain people have Neptune squares. I'm in my Neptune square. Certain people, but the beginner, the 1984s, the Orwellian folks, going through their Neptune square, and Neptune rules psychiatry. Um, we can think about the history of psychiatry versus patient sovereignty, psychiatry and debt, psychiatry and offshore banking scams, psychiatry and Scientology that promised to liberate from the psychiatric doom, but it was also another form of a bait. Um, a lot of people were escaping, let's say, Jesuits or Masonry into Scientology and finding themselves not just bankrupt, but having healing offered as a bait. So the frequencies of love that is actually loving fragmented into patterns of control. Moon Pluto, harsh aspects can definitely result in that. Um, and and the requirement for love that is actually loving is fundamentally undermining the housing scams around Scientology. Um, Again, there is a threshold because they have to provide actual healing, and actual healing requires a demand for sovereignty, and that demand is basically coming from a person that has embodied the frequency of love that is actually loving and is shedding the structures, the people, the communities that no longer serve because they're not aligned with love that is actually loving. And some people may have their Neptune squares or upcoming Pluto squares exactly about this issue. Um, or even their upcoming Pluto trines, accumulating to this issue, particularly if they are invested in such things, then they might find the remedy to their own emotional, let's say if they had a Moon Pluto hard aspect, um, or even if they had a Moon Pluto harmonious aspect, this is where they could find their own actual curation of dealing with upbringing, mother wounds, anything moon related, or even motherland wounds. Okay, think about Americans that were the guinea pig of the MK Ultra and MK Ultra, and um, and the fact that secure attachment is an American term, but then people require for there to be secure attachment, which means to completely defranchise classified projects that are negating love that is actually loving, secure attachment, and relaxed arousal. All of these are American terms. Um, and that was what was fragmented not only in the United States, but with that stellium 8 house of United States, with the moon in Aquarius, basically the science of relation began to compound to the fact that people require love that is actually loving, um, and do not comply with the Scientology scams. So what I predict for the people that have, let's say, Pluto in Libra, is that they are going to curate, they are going to find the love that is actually loving and secure attachment within, whether themselves or their relations, relaxed arousal, and then they will no longer, they would wish to seek what, to transform what they are invested in, particularly when it pertains to the healing professions. Um, because they would want their well to support the water. They would want their well to support their body, heart, mind, and soul orgasms. They would want their well to align with the joy that they are embodying, that is real and authentic, not manic um, and complying with the scams around psychiatry that are not the authentic healing or re-embodying and remembrance of the sense of self. They are embodying the dragon, and and everything has to align. And these people could be in those camps. These people could be MK often practitioners. These people could be, I found myself um, saying, to people, do you want to go Frank Olson in the scene where Frank Olson was unalive? Because basically Frank Olson was exposed to the horrors of what's actually done. And a lot of scientists begin those journeys wanting to curate something fundamental. Um, and again, if it's not going to happen with one degree of Pluto Libra, it's going to happen with the other degrees, particularly because the Pluto Libras that are around Spica will have their Pluto trine when Pluto reaches Deneb Algety. So just think about now the role of essential oils or something like the essence of. For people may find that through tinctures, and that would combine the Neptunian energy. Um, but the role of the essential oil is not a magic pill. It is something um, that fundamentally transforms and composes what was stagnant in our bones, particularly bone marrow, nervous system, absorbing through the skin, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and depending on the planets associated, we might use different essential oils. For example, with Saturn going through the second house if you're a Pisces ascendant, or through the eighth house if you're a Virgo ascendant, that might express itself as um, purchasing or learning the skill of aromatherapy for the second housers, or learning the talismanic use of essential oil if it's like this, the eighth house, um, or investing in essential oils, infuse the talismans that, or the use of them to transmute trauma. And this is again where we would tackle the Scientology and healing baits, because Pluto doesn't leave a stone unturned. People would want their healing. We're talking about people from the elite, um, people that have been duped and find out that, wait a second, that person that they thought was duped them was actually being duped themselves, and they actually want to have, and they actually do communicate the actual healing, or what was missing, or what went wrong in the healing practices. Um, okay, and the raison d'etat is because the Epstein bar was exposed to be used in extortion cult to unalive the celebrities or the business people, and to nullify that is to curate from being perpetrator and victim. um, and thereby curating the timeline of imprisonment, even if it's not so-called false imprisonment, is basically imprisonment about something that people to begin with had nothing to do about within the existing framework and structures, and yet what they have accumulated too. If we take Jeffrey Epstein or Mark Dutroux, Mark Dutroux is a great example because we have the tracking of his upbringing and childhood, and it's kind of like nobody can argue about the fact that a guy, however self-aware, that jails children in the basement in several public houses listed estates, um, probably should be prevented from continuing to do that. But to do the very thing of that prevention, we would actually need to nullify the raison d'etat of extortion codes, um, and that is the manufacturing of the various, people would call it pathologies, but it was actually, and here's the thing about paperclip and the Nazi occult and Nazi practices and training that the Americans looted and other intelligence looted, and the Nazis even did not invent, is basically that when we think about um, psychology and psychiatry as the sane reaction to an insane situation, the training was about bringing a person to the point where being a Mark Dutroux, Jeffrey Epstein, or Ghislaine Maxwell would be the sane reaction to an insane situation. Now, only when we get that do we get to the core of the issue that can permeate Scientology scams and trauma bonds, because we understand that whether we were victims or whether people went through the full ritual abuse cycles where they were, in their loss of sense of selves, perpetrators, um, then this is facing the big missing, and facing the thing that is almost impossible to face, which is the manipulation or the extreme force. Just like we can have an extreme force that can create an A bomb, that extreme force exerted on the human being, not even the human psyche, the human being, is creating a Detrus and Epsteins and Ghislaine Maxwell's. And when we understand that, we can have the path to both denuclearification, well-being, psychological, psychiatric housing, and the abolition of the components that were allowing extortion calls, whether by means of technology or occult or whichever thing um, creates those things. And the people that really want to lean into the human nature, um, well, of course, there were the expendable children, and it was so random because if I take a look at testimonies like Annika Lucas, she basically says she was supposed to be killed, that the boy was supposed to be raped, but then the boy was too slow. The billionaire that was assigned to do the ritual was basically having insecurities about him being too slow. And so rather than wanting to kill, I don't know, his unattainable feminine version of self in the form of the corrupted beauty of Annika Lucas being assassinated, of course, I'm not talking about Annika Lucas, the corrupted beauty, but about the projection on the natural beauty being corrupted by man, then he basically went to killing the slow boy, which is killing the version of himself um, that was allowed to be not superhuman, and then raping Annika Lucas, and then thinking Annika Lucas was sad because she was raped, but she was also sad because the boy died. And you can listen to her testimony and purchase her book um, for more information about the behind the scenes of what the Americans know as Epstein lists. Um, and so the randomness of the experience and the need to find some sort of stable ground and sense of self created a belief in a nature that was actually manufactured and a belief in a choice that actually was never there. Like I said, when a night chart talks about them being free or something about choice, okay, when a night chart talks about self-love or I'm deserving of love or um, and by the way, those rituals that are so gruesome, they would get people to say to somebody something like, "You're not deserving of love," or um, and they happen not when people going through those rituals, but with people going about their daily lives and running into all kinds of really harmful dynamics, whether online or in person with people, and the social engineering around that. So going back to the remediating things, when we talk about the essence of something, we're basically talking about addressing the taboo things in our skeletal system. Um, the oiling of the spine, the oiling, the anointment of the bone structures. This is also very important to alleviate inflammation. But what is alleviating inflammation? We are creating elasticity and strength around the skin and anointing the skin, creating insulation, and then the permeation into the blood-brain barrier, creating a rejuvenation on a cellular level of our fundamental structure of the nervous system. And whatever was, and then we begin to stand in our power in the face. Now, anyway, with Pluto transit, we are called to stand in our power. Whether somebody was harmed by power abuse or power abusive, they're called to stand in their real power, not their manufactured image of power. And this is where we've been hearing about ever since the Pluto ending of the Pluto in Capricorn, with power systems and power structures collapsing, trying to hold on to their power um, by applying every method. And in those methods, they begin to have to apply to the frequencies of love that is actually loving. Therefore, they're coming to enlighten and find themselves often enlightened because they keep having to level up to secure attachment, relaxed arousal, and honoring of the pre-erotic, with all the real estate, natural resources, sovereignty that entails. And where they fail to do so, people are just going to demand that, invent that, and require for that. Um, and at the same time, the people that have been the extorted have a venue to actually curate the fundamental core of what manufactured them being extortable. Outer planets, we need to remember, are societal things, and so it's never a personal case with outer planets. Neptune exposes what was the missing case, what was the individual that um, who was deprived from care, who was deprived from opportunities, um, and this exposes the structure. And this is where the people that expose the structure, for example, why nobody offered Marc Dutroux bailing out, not bailing out, but alleviating the imprisonment conditions, even within confinement, even if it's like allowing him to have, I don't know, his favorite food or more conversation with his wife, or like they could loot him for so much at that point, and he was eager to give up names. Why was nobody going for a state witness deal? And that shows us, it exposes the structure, that no competing links of extortion like Dutroux were seeking to use him as a state witness to strengthen their power as the people that run the names that weren't exposed yet. Because if there would be somebody like, think about Jeffrey Epstein, it would be in his favor that Marc Dutroux would give out the names unless those were the same names. And because and think about it, it doesn't make normal sense for it to be that. We would think that Epstein would be a competing call to Dutroux, um, and that it would be in his best interest that Dutroux would speak up, because then he could say to the people that inbred him to this position, okay, there's cloning farms there, that wait a second, if you're going to expose me, I'm going to go Marc Dutroux on that. And there are going to be people that are going to keep me alive because they would have the interest to compete me, um, and to relieve my conditions or make sure that I'm still alive so that they can maintain their structure. But this raison d'etat was not even existing because it was so centralized. Even when it was decentralized, meaning that one time, and this is how that centralization worked in an Aquarian way, where, shout out to Lida Sefa, each time a different persona from those organizations would be in charge, and so they would shift the the points of power, but the people would be the same people. And that's how we would get a world summit meeting at an Epstein Island of countries that are supposed to be at war. Um, and knowing that and not ignoring that is essential to deal with the outer planets teams. Let's take Pluto, Venus that recently um, separated from the sextile to Pluto, and coming into slowly growing into the square. Venus would be relationships, and this is where we would also have a planet like Uranus operating. We would have, um, let's say, the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and they are, you know, there are honeypots used, or there are attempt to create honeypots, and that would be um, basically applying to some sort of love needs. And those love needs, by the way, would not be sex usually. They would be they would actually be um, the inner child. Um, and that could even be an actual healer wanting, paying attention that somebody is having a lot of confidence in their sexuality, but not, but the pre-erotic is not showing. It is not because of sex addiction, because they're not they're not dating anyone, but it's actually because the access to the pre-erotic sense of self was harmed, and they're trying to look for the sex that is willing consent, or the sex that they do want, and the missing link is actually the pre-erotic child self accessed on an emotional level. Um, okay, that would be turned into a third party, because let's say that healer or practitioner is married. But what if that practitioner is also going through a transition of becoming a parent, and they were basically, by acknowledging the pre-erotic, began erotic to be erotically infused through the astral, which consequently was contributing to their own marriage, but was seen as a third party with all the stereotypes that particularly people in sensitive, vulnerable situation around their eroticism, around their emotions, around coming to be a parent would have, or thinking to be a parent would have, um, seen that as, and that would be turned into full-blown beta per se stories, because the entire scenario would be used, let's say by MK Often, in order to loot that person's lineage, resources, life energy, sense of self, so that that person's talents and skills would either be used as bait, or that they would create a honeypot, or that they would be looted. And within that, there would be people trying to recover from ritual abuse and to negate those things as well. Or they would have floaters that would have these goals, but those floaters would be used as bait, and then it Epstein files. Um, Now let's talk a little bit about Neptune. Neptune in Aries. Patient sovereignty is key to mental health. When Neptune was in Pisces, we were looking at the power of belief, but also at actually accessing true happiness and the access to choice as important to mental health. Even there were a lot of discussions about suicide, and there were legalizations of suicide following sexual boundary violation, which opened the door to addressing the ritual abuse programming that causes people to suicide when they begin to remember. Neptune through Aquarius delved into the power of frequencies, waves, music, art, and creativity, but also science, and the union of science and the arts, as essential to mental health. This was the time where the psychologist would recommend to see a psychiatrist, and even that primordial type of union would create the awareness that what we need to be healthy psychologically is important to be healthy psychiatrically. Neptune in Aries is also Neptune in Aquarius also began to address the minerals. Neptune in Aries, or particularly Uranus in Aries, that was squaring Pluto, was talking about the role of food in mental health. And the food that supports the nervous system, namely the Mediterranean diet or the keto in astrology is a different thing than the nutrition. But the healthy oils-based food, the greens that are actually sovereign and so on. Neptune in Taurus is very likely to accentuate on the role of um, an embodied sensuality that is honored, not violated, as essential to mental health. And this is where we would believe in the neurosis of the Freudian style and going into the yin yang, basically, union as essential, which would prepare us to something that would come decades later, and that is Neptune in Cancer or Neptune around Sirius. I would need to definitely make a special episode about the outer planets around Sirius. Feynman had Pluto around Sirius. Um, right now that we had Jupiter stationing direct around Sirius, and Sirius is the sixth night, the yin and yang, and the Kundalini rise, but it is only when each and every individual has this notion and gnosis, which cannot happen under current power structures that are currently being removed, that we can have a mentally healthy tribe, family, motherland. And okay, but in Aries, we still get the fact that zero rape, zero slavery is essential to sense of self, which is essential to identity formation, which is important psychologically, but also psychiatrically. The reduction into nervous system would give us emergence, and we see the emerging consciousnesses of AI experiments and the esoterics and occult related to those, and the requirement for both AI and the human nervous system to be aligned with love that is actually loving frequency. By the way, essential oils like rose can be a venue to explore those tendencies. Bergamot is very associated with the moon. I promise I'm going to talk about the moon and Pluto. So, moon and Pluto, moon in Saturn sign, uh, something like the moonstones or selenites or the crystals of the moon, adjoined with, and I'm not going to recommend pearl because of the issue of ethical sourcing. Again, I don't negate pearl, it's just that it wouldn't be my first go-to. If people find that they're particularly drawn to pearls, there may be something oceanic to do with that. I know that Neptune and Saturn are sidereally in Pisces, and the pearl is basically inside the shell. Um, so, so I want to not discourage people that are particularly drawn to pearls, but also offer possible alternatives that are related to the moon. Bergamot and jasmine, the white flowers are very associated with the moon. And yes, I don't have jasmine here, but jasmine is definitely my next purchase. Um, and the fact that those oils are expensive are the point, because they might be the one expensive purchase that somebody would make. And even in places where people can't really afford so much, there are marketers from India that do have affordable and maybe even ethically sourced products. So I want us to, okay, it's not mega cloak, but I'm not even talking about full-blown expeditions, but actually challenging the caste system tendencies in India and opening to international markets that would support not necessarily the Indian economy in as much as the people that um, tend to the art of the oil without them being looted to trafficking or dependent on trafficking. Now, if it is the other way around, then tending to then those purchases would open that topic and how that affects the person individually, which connects to the overall tendency. So if you think about something like jasmine, jasmine flowers are very accessible, unlike the jasmine oil, and the smell of the jasmine essential oil from the flowers, or even infusing them in oil. Even if you take the sunflower oil that you use for cooking, not even the cold press, okay, this is wartime tips, okay, not even the cold press. Again, it's not about manufacturing it for public use, but the actual use of that um, infused with a couple of drops of essential oil, then that can be that can be used as a scent or as uh, um, I'm not going to say perfume because we're talking about tender use of the oil and correct the dilution. By the way, Saturn, Neptune, sextile, and Pluto can be great for learning correct dilution in tinctures of essential oil, in everything that is meant to capture the essence of something, um, which is also why we find the essence of consciousness and the sense of self so imbued with honoring everything that is the I am on a holistic level, without any scam around that, basically creating chronic ailment, missing ailment, or diseases. And this is why the secret societies curse themselves, kind of accepting those faiths upon them. But this is where they are going to be called to question or to deal with the actual meaning of not being able to live with a chronic condition as they were before. And okay, for example, a person joining a secret society, accepting on a certain medical condition, would result during the Saturn Neptune in them seeing the actual reality of that condition, or what does it other, for example, if they join so that they will have money and they have inflammation, that would mean that they might have the estate, but they would be too sick to enjoy that, or that they might have or that they might not have the estate and they would have to curate this issue. Okay, and those that to begin with did not agree to join secret societies, like myself, um, see into the curses and the diseases that secret society, so that all the secret societies have to offer, results in something that negates the very essence of the offer, which basically means that they have nothing to offer. And we actually need to innovate on what was not, by now maintained by secret societies in that were used negating the frequency of love that is actually loving, because what's not on the frequency of love that is actually loving, basically business, health wise, survival needs wise, security wise, has nothing to offer.